right. As I said, 1 Corinthians chapter 7 today. I'll give you a little warning as we come into this. Chapter 7 is a very critical chapter, and what it deals with, the issues there are very important to us, but it is also a very controversial chapter. I'll let you know this in the beginning. There is not universal agreement on all the contents here and the meaning of the contents here. There's some difference of opinion in the Christian circles about issues here that are raised about marriage, divorce, and singleness, and all this, that, and so forth. And I'm going to let you know as we go into this, I do not do survey courses. So I'm not going to go in here and go, here's the 4 options or 3 options or whatever, and say, here's the different feelings on this, here's what this pastor says or this theologian says, and pick your poison, whatever you like best. That's not what I'm going to do. I believe it is the task of our class to go in and to determine the best of our ability what the text says. Now, with that said, I also say this. I think in all honesty, most of the divisions are a lack of an understanding of the context and the meaning of the text. So as proud as it may sound, I'm letting you know, I think it is not that hard to arrive at a single understanding of this that is the best understanding. With that said also, I know this, it is very likely, since it is controversial, there may be someone who disagrees with me, and that is fine. But I would challenge you with this. Be careful, because I find that most people come to this text with a predisposition of what they want to find. And they find it. And because of how Paul words this, because of what goes on here, they find justification for it. If you're going to challenge where we go in this text, I would put this out to you. I want you to challenge it based on some understanding of the text, other extraneous texts that speak to this. I want you to be sure, biblically, you would disagree, not philosophically. Because that is what matters. What does the text say? What does God have to say? So we're going to be dealing with this for some time. Now I want you to understand the context. This is all very important. There's a context to all of this, and I think it's critical that we really nail that down as we start this. And this is what caused me. As I told you, I was thinking, let's do all 40 verses. We need to understand everything coming into this. So there's the first one. This is one I shared with you before. What we're dealing with here is Paul is dealing with the issue of sexual immorality in the culture and in the church. The culture has come into the church. In fact, we've seen that the culture has come so dominant in the church that they're doing things that are shocking to the immoral world around them. Remember that? And what Paul is dealing with here is he's trying to come to grips with what do we do to solve this problem? How do Christians live in such a world and live differently, effectively? And so Paul is focusing on that. With that said, this is important. Paul is not trying to give you a vast and complete biblical theology on marriage and divorce and other things. He is dealing with a very specific problem. And because he makes some comments you have to understand in that context. So when Paul sounds very cut and dried, it's because he is focusing on that issue and not trying to give you everything there is to know about some of these topics. Some of you are old enough to remember this. There was an old TV show called Dragnet. And Sergeant Joe Friday would always come in, and looking into the crime, he would come along and say this, ma'am, I want the facts and only the facts. This is Paul. We're getting down to the facts. So I'm going to try to give you the backdrop for that so you can understand why he says things in the way that he does sometimes, because it's important here to get that context down. Now, understanding this, what is the context of the culture? Why is this such a big deal? First off, I want you to understand the culture here had major issues. This is not a moral culture. In Roman culture, marriage, divorce rates, I should say, are rampant. It was not uncommon for a man, not always a woman, but men who took advantage of this, to have dozens of marriages. It was an overwhelming kind of problem. There are other things we're going to see about this, that there are reasons, there are problems in this, and marriage was not seen very highly. The culture was filled with sexuality. We've seen that before. If you remember when we looked at Corinth in its context. Sexuality was part of every aspect of life. It was not uncommon. A man gets married, and he has his wife to provide an heir and to keep his home. And he also had 2 or 3 women on the side to fill the other needs, because that's how things go. I'm not giving you as an example of saying that's what's happening in any way. Don't start looking and go, who's involved? No, that's not the thing. But that was an attitude. The wife was the legitimate person to provide that heir and keep the home, but everybody understood that why should you limit yourself in any such way? I want you to understand this as well. This is, again, nothing new under the sun. Homosexuality was rampant in the culture, in the upper crust of the culture. Common people know, but those who saw themselves as being elevated above the norm and the common man's kind of restrictions and so forth, the high-level thinkers, isn't that what's going on in our world?
Yes.
Yeah.
Plato called that the highest form of love.
Yeah, there you go. This was high thinking. We're beyond the limitations the common people deal with. We think more deeply. We see things they don't see. I was remembering that there was a comment made in an interview with the former governor of New York, Cuomo's daughter, where she came out as pansexual. And she made the comment. She goes, I don't understand when people go, so, because in my circle of friends, it's so cool to identify in these ways. Now, there's a reason it's gone from less than 1% in the World War II generation to the current Gen Z period, 21%, because it's cool. And that was going on then. That was a big thing that was very big and prominent in what they were dealing with. So that was an attitude they have. There's also this context. This is from the very first verse. Now for the matters you wrote about. See that? Here's what the setting is for Paul. You have this rampant sexuality, and it is also rampantly happening in the church. But there was evidently a section of Corinth, the people, the believers in Corinth, that wanted to solve these problems. They wanted to get a handle and control over this problem in the culture at large. And so they come up with a list of solutions, and they're running it by Paul. They have sent him a letter, and in this letter are a list of things they're thinking of doing in order to get this problem under control in their lives and in the life of the church. I will give you a little clue into that. Most of the ideas stink. They're mostly really bad ideas on how to solve the problem, and Paul has to deal with this and try to straighten them out. But what he is doing in these 40 verses is he's going through this list of questions and answering one after the other. Is this the way to solve the problem? Is this a way we're going to get on top of this and get control of it? Now, with that understanding, we also have a biblical context that's different than the world. As I said, marriage was not held in high esteem in the Roman culture. Divorce was very common. It was also a very low view of women. Women were little more than a convenience, a political, financial need, or simply to be used, property. And so marriage didn't have a very high view. Now we have to understand, Paul is coming at this from a very biblical view of marriage. Does God have a high view of marriage? Yes. What makes you think so?
He came up with it.
He came up with it. There's my beginning point. If it was his idea, it's immediately good. I think that's a nice starting point. I think that's the most basic one of all. Anything else you want to put? Why? Yeah.
It's the picture of our relationship with Christ.
There it is. It is a foundational element of our very testimony. We are demonstrating the love of God for his church. We are seeing that in a relational thing between a man and a woman, how God cares. Anything else?
Well, along those lines, he calls Jesus the bridegroom and the church the bride. He couches it in terms of the marriage.
He makes sure you have to see. This is the illustration I'm after here. He doesn't make it hard to find, does he?
Right.
Lays it all out there.
And he also has that verse about, what he puts together, do not let man put asunder.
There you go. There's the one. God saw this as the most central relationship in life, and he saw it as a permanent, lifelong relationship. How do I know that? Well, Malachi 2:16 has a rather blunt statement on that. Remember this one? For I hate divorce, says the Lord, the God of Israel. I don't think you miss a lot in that. Notice there's no qualifications, unless there's a good reason for it. He doesn't say that. He's saying even where the Bible may allow for it, I would prefer it didn't happen. I hate divorce. That's pretty strong.
It has another meaning, right?
Oh yeah, always hate has a completely different meaning here. No.
It's a metaphor.
Yeah, it's a metaphor.
Okay, and understand this. Biblically, this was a problem for Israel and the later church because that seems rather narrow. That is not how they wanted to live. You might remember this when the apostles are hearing Jesus says, I expect these relationships to last a life. A man shouldn't put his wife aside. And the apostles go, well, maybe it's better not to marry. The apostles really saw that. They go, if you just can't get rid of her when you're tired, what's the point? I'm not going to get in this prison. And that's why, yeah, go ahead.
Well, and that same thought is now current, right?
Yes, it
why,
is.
Why am I gonna get married if I'm just gonna get divorced and do all that business? Why don't we just shack up together? So much easier.
And the attitude begins with the assumption it will lead to
It will
divorce.
lead to divorce.
God had a different assumption as a starting point. But here's the other thing that we often miss, and Peter put this one in. He called marriage something. Remember what Peter referred to marriage as? The grace of life. That's from 1 Peter. I really like that. The grace of life. God had two things. One, I intended to be permanent. Two, I intended to be enjoyable. My purpose in this was to be the addition that made life better. Don't view it as a prison. If you have the right view of it, it was meant to be the most enriching single relationship you will ever have. That's what God started. This is what Paul's understanding is. This is the starting point for the whole thing. Those are important to have an understanding here for the context. Paul is approaching it from that viewpoint. Now, here's the other thing I want you to understand. This is an important passage, and unfortunately, in Christian circles, not just the world, there are Christian circles that will say this. This is the one passage that we really can just toss out in Scripture. And there's a reason for it. The reason is simply this. If you look at Paul writing here, Paul lets you know he is not speaking for God. He's offering his own opinion. And what do we care about Paul's opinion? How do I know that's the attitude? Where do they get that?
This is not for the Lord.
There's some things here. Verse 10, to the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. Well, why is he saying that? He's making it plain. He says this is God's command, not man. A wife must not separate from her husband. Verse 12, to the rest of this, I say this, and not the Lord. You see, the God bounces back and forth. Over here it's what God is saying. Over here it's what Paul is saying. So they say it's so convoluted. It gets rolled around. As a matter of fact, it even gets worse. Jump over to verse 25. Now about virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment. Well, if God didn't speak on it, where do you get off telling us that, but here's your opinion again?
Kind of an apostle.
Verse 40, I believe. In my judgment, she is happier if she stays as she is. Well, I don't care what you think, Paul. Here's Paul actually saying, I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but in my best guess, and that's how they read that. Now, is that what Paul is saying here? I want you to understand something. There was a story this past week I found intriguing. Baseball, we're in Pride Month, of course, right? We're all have to have pride, and it's all about this alphabet soup of sexuality. We're supposed to have pride. Baseball has had a pride patch that all their players are supposed to wear on their uniform. And a group of players took theirs off and played the game. And of course, they had to come under scrutiny for this. There was a question. A reporter came up afterwards, wanted to find out. And guess what their reason was for not wearing the pride patch? They were Christians. They were Christians. And the spokesperson said, we want to be very clear here. We're not trying to say that we hate anyone, that we don't want them to come out to the park and enjoy the game like anyone else. We're saying that from our Christian perspective, we cannot wear a patch that says we have pride in a conduct that is seen in Scripture as sin. He wasn't eloquent, but he was very straightforward, and I thought it was a good and solid answer. The reporter immediately wrote the story on this, and the reporter made a comment. He says, I'm sick and tired of people using Christianity as an excuse for bigotry. He says, I'm tired of people using an excuse for bigotry and for hatred of gay people. And here was his challenge. He said, find me any place where Jesus says this is wrong, where Jesus says, commands us to hate gays and lesbians and so forth. And then he puts at the end of his article, I'm waiting. Okay? Here's the reality. It's something we need to understand. And this is the reason I don't like red letter editions of the Bible. Jesus did not address every theological issue in the church. As a matter of fact, the person who gives us more of our theology as a church than any other writer was Paul. Because Jesus left that to his apostles. He assigned authority to his apostles to say, here's the rest of the information, and they were going to be given the special ability of revelation to speak from the authority as an apostle. So what is Paul saying in our passages here? He's saying, here's something you know because Jesus said it and you all know what Jesus said. Here's some new information I'm giving you that Jesus didn't say, and I'm saying it from my authority as an apostle. He's saying not, this is just my opinion, take it or leave it, maybe you like it, maybe you don't. He's saying, this is new revelation, this is something you haven't heard before, and this is still binding. So we're not going to just toss the text out and go to the next best understanding. Not to mention the whole idea of hate had nothing to do with it. Jesus never talked about hate, he talked about sin, but that's not the matter. So then Paul is going to answer these things. He's going to go after this and try to answer this series of questions to bring home a solution and say, are these solutions to the problem at hand? Okay, here's the first question, the one we're going to deal with today. Here's what they came up with. They decided that since sexual immorality was so rampant, such a problem, people just couldn't deal with it. You see it messing up marriages, you see it messing up lives, you see it happening in the church now where a man is with his father's wife. I know what we'll do. We'll declare celibacy. We'll just forget marriage. We'll forget sexuality entirely. We'll just do away with it. We'll declare ourselves above and beyond that fray, and we will decide not to get involved in anything where it will ever happen in our lives. And this is the question that Paul has to answer. Is celibacy an answer? And here's what grew out of that. Now you might run across this. There came this attitude that tended to grow that people thought that really it was a sign of a greater spirituality. If you didn't have to marry, and if you didn't get involved with women, those evil, polluting women, if you didn't do this, life got better. And you know which church adopted the idea that the most spiritual among us would take a vow of celibacy and now serve God and God alone and never have a marriage in their life? Roman Catholic Church. That's where this largely began, this idea. I mean, if you're unaware of this, certain nun orders actually wear a ring showing their marriage to Jesus Christ, to God. This is their dedication. So here's the question. Here's the thing that comes up. Is this a solution to the problem? Paul is going to try to answer that. Bless you. And good morning, Ruby. Good to see you. Nice you guys made it. Not a problem. We have chairs. Get yourself comfortable. Now let me give you a structure. Why would they come up with the idea of celibacy being an answer, and why would this come up? Well, basically it was such a convoluted mess that they felt they couldn't sort it out in the ancient world. Roman law did not have any single standard for what constituted marriage. There were any number of ways that relationships were formed in the Roman world, and it was very involved, and people had an issue with it, or how to sort it out. No uniform code. For instance, slaves outnumbered Roman citizens vastly in the Roman Empire, and there was no legal marriage for slaves. Here's what happened. Man and woman want to be together. They had to ask their owner, will you allow us to cohabit? Will you allow us to live together as man? And if the owner said yes, they could. If the owner said no, they're done. Here's the problem with that relationship. It had no legal standing in the Roman world. What had legal standing was the owner's status of owning a slave. What could the owner do at any time he so chose? Sell a slave. And if he decided to take the husband or wife out of that relationship, what could they do about it? Consequently, there were a number of Christians here going, my spouse was taken away. I had nothing to say about this. Here's the world I live in. I've had people tell me this. I've always gotten amazed by some of the excuses we use, but I've had people actually say, it's overblown. That there was a lot of cruelty in American slavery. Beating a piece of property was just a terrible thing. Okay, let's say you're right, that the beatings and things didn't happen nearly as often as people try to make it out. I have to ask you this. Can you think of anything more brutal in your life than a person who has the power to come in and take your husband or wife out of that setting anytime they want to, or to take your children and sell them like they would a litter of puppies? To me, whether there's physical violence or not, that's a brutal system. I can think of nothing more horrid than that kind of thought. And this is what they had, and this is what they dealt with. There was another thing, because they had the beginnings of common law marriage. You didn't always have a Roman official, you didn't always even have a pagan priest in the town, and in small towns and so forth, marriage was basically by consent. A couple agreed to, and Roman law decided this: if you manage to get at least 1 year in, and you don't break up,
And a day, right?
and a day, you're in a day, exactly right, we'll declare it marriage and we'll recognize it. If you come into town, if you move, even though there's no paperwork, there's no formal decree, it's marriage. And so that was the second one. There was another common means. You purchased your bride. Women were property. We have the deal. I see you have an eligible daughter here, John. And things are a little tough, I understand. I got a deal. Dave over here has an eligible son.
1,000 camels.
1,000 camels? Dave, counteroffer. What do you got?
I don't want to be involved in that.
And we do the counteroffer. We do that, and we go, and you would purchase it. And whether the woman liked the relationship or not, it's now marriage. And so they look at this and they go, marriage is not anything like what God intended. It's not being worked out. Why don't we just forget the whole thing? This is such a convoluted mess. Why don't we just jump out of this thing and say what we're going to do is get away from it? Now, there was a legitimate form of marriage that was highly recognized among the upper crust in Rome, and it was a full ceremony. You might recognize some of the elements of the ceremony. You would get a maid of honor, a matron of honor, and a best man, and it was their job to plan the event. You held a day-long thing where people came down. You gave vows before a priest. There were flowers, often the wreath or the floral bouquet for the bride, and they exchanged rings, which were put on the third finger of the left hand to signify this union. And you know why they chose that finger? Roman people who had practiced medicine, they cut on cadavers to find out as much as they could about the human body, believed they had discovered that there was a nerve that ran all the way from the third finger to the heart. And they felt that this was a symbol of that union that would touch the heart, and therefore became the third finger of the left hand. They also, at the end of this thing, had a celebration where they always had cake. I find it interesting that Christianity and all of our marriage ceremonies had nothing to do with the Bible. They didn't come from any Bible description of a marriage. They came from Roman common practice. And this was a recognized form. So these are the ways you could get married. But I said very few of them had much structure or protection for women. And women didn't have a high view of the whole process. There became a women's live movement that was active in Corinth and throughout the Roman Empire, rebelling against all of this practice and this misuse of women. They had several things. One, they would try to avoid getting married. They'd leave the home and make it on their own. Or if they got into marriage, they refused to have children. They weren't going to lose their figure to a guy who was going to take the child, have a child with them, and then go do his own thing while you had to take care of it all on your own. If the guy's not being involved, he gets nothing, was basically the thinking. There were also women who then would dress as men. They went out and tried to do and go to the places that men went to make a statement. There were some that protested by having sporting events in which the women would go bare-topped through the town doing sporting events. Now, this is one of the strangest things, because I've seen this in our modern women's movement, protests where women will bare themselves to protest against being seen as a sexual object. I'm just going to say, this is not helping the problem. These are the things they were doing. Julian, the Roman philosopher, said this: what modesty can you expect from a woman who wears a helmet, hates her own sex, and delights in feats of strength? So you have this rebellious attitude of what we're going to do about this. And so it grew up in the church, a group that thought, in such a mess where nothing makes sense, let's go with celibacy. Let's just say we're going to elevate ourselves out of the whole mess, and we are going to have a higher calling. Here's where Paul addresses this. Now I want you to follow this very carefully. Paul is going to answer that question, is this a good idea? And I want to tell you something, let me give it away in the beginning. He doesn't answer it in verse 1, he answers it in verse 2. And everybody stops in verse 1. Here we go. Now for the matters that you wrote about, it is good for a man not to marry. Now does anybody have a different translation there? Not to touch a woman. That's the literal translation. That is, if you go through the Old Testament, not to touch a woman talks about sexual intercourse. That's what the phrase talks to. It's not just saying go and touch a woman. It's saying that to enter into, and he's saying this, and understand why yours is mine's translated marriage, because in the biblical understanding, the only place that should occur is in marriage. And I think that's what Paul means here. It is better, it is good, it is a good thing. Here's what Paul starts with. You say you want to talk about celibacy, you want to avoid marriage, that's good. Be very careful here. He's not saying that's the only thing. He's not even saying that's the better thing. And he's not saying it's for everyone. He's just saying if someone is going to be single, that's fine.
It's a viable option.
It's a viable option. Now I want you to understand something. Context again. Two groups of believers in the common church. What were the two groups from? Jews and Gentiles. Okay? The Gentiles are the probably ones writing this because the Gentile culture is the dominant one. Jewish believers had a very different view. And their thing was this. They went to the opposite extreme. Here was their thinking. A man of marriageable age who is not married is a travesty and a sin. A woman without children is the worst possible kind of thing. She's not truly a woman. Why did they think that? Where did they get this idea that this was what God commanded and you had to do this or you were in sin? Be fruitful and multiply. The command's right there in the first book, for heaven's sakes. How did you miss that? So in their thinking, and that's the thinking that primarily, I frankly has dominated the church for a number of things. We kind of have this, what's that guy single for? What's wrong with him? What's his problem? I wonder why. Maybe he's a little, and we have all these thoughts that go through our head. Why can't she get married? Why? We have words for that, spinster, terrible things. This is the tension that's going on here. So Paul addresses this first of all to deal with that group and say, if a man or a woman chooses to be single in Christ, that's fine. They're not weird. They're not sinning. They're not some bizarre thing nobody wants. It's an option that is available. That's not the answer to the question, though. What was the question? Is celibacy the solution to sexual sin in the world? Is that a solution? I want you to think about this for a second. Paul mentions this several times. He specifies, if you are like me. Now, what does that mean? Paul saw himself as being gifted to be single. Why is that important?
Some aren't gifted.
Some aren't. As a matter of fact, let's look at verse 2. Most aren't. Paul is saying that's an option, but is that going to solve the problem of sexual sin? Here's Paul's verse 2. But since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Here's what he says. For some of us, if we have the gift, celibacy is an option. But will it solve the problem? No, because are most people gifted for celibacy? No. As a matter of fact, if the Catholic Church has taught us anything, what have we found out by compelling people to serve God by claiming a vow of chastity, celibacy? Has that worked out so well in quelling any kind of sexual desire and sexual activity? Not hardly. Unless you're gifted for it, the problem is not solved by that. Here's what Paul, it's made worse. You've just made it worse. As a matter of fact, he's saying, rather than this being a solution to avoid marriage, marriage is the solution. You get his point? The solution for most of you is this: that each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Why? Because there is so much immorality. So he's saying, in answer to your question, is celibacy going to solve the problem? No. The thing you're trying to do with is a bigger solution than yours. Now, people get upset. Well, Paul puts marriage in such a low light here. Remember our context. Paul is dealing with the issue of sexual immorality. He's not trying to give you the full theology on marriage. He's trying to answer the question, are you solving the problem by getting rid of marriage? And his answer is
No.
no. Bad choice, bad idea. That's not going to get you there. And people go crazy on this one, I know. They always want to stop at the first one. You know, here she says, it's good not to touch a woman. You know, there are churches that will literally put men and women on the opposite side of the church because they mean it literally.
Wow.
You're not even allowed to address or greet a woman in church because you might touch her. And how evil would that be? This is where they go with this. This is the balance of it. And I want you to understand, Paul is only focusing on one reason for marriage here. And the Bible gives us at least 6. Take a shot at this. You think of any other reason the Bible gives us for marriage?
It's not good for men to be alone.
Companionship. Let's hold on to that. What else?
Procreation.
Procreation. Anything else?
Glorification.
Glorification. Okay, you're putting this. Let me put this in. Procreation is one of the beginning points. God had this interesting idea that the best thing for society, the best thing for people in general, was to have a man and a woman who would commit together for life, who would have children together and raise them together. Radical. Crazy radical. And he said this was the best way for society to advance. Now, some churches have stopped right there and actually teach that procreation is the only reason for sexual relations in marriage. Not true. Here's the next reason for marriage: pleasure. We saw this last time we were together, Proverbs 5. We saw that guy getting pretty eloquent in describing what his wife looked like and how much he enjoyed the physical attributes. So do the Song of Songs sometime, probably with younger children out of the room, but read it. I love this one. Isaac was sporting with his wife. You know what sporting means? That means they were getting physical. And it was out in the open and people were going by, would you get a room? It was meant to be enjoyable. That is part of the reason for it. Here's one that we don't like to talk: provision. The idea was that a man would look after and see to the needs of a woman. Now, I know our culture says that's an evil thing and puts women in second class, but here's the simple reality. When a woman becomes pregnant, when she's going to have a child, the odds are it's going to impact her ability to provide all the needs. And guess what? Here's a fact we found. You know what the largest contributing factor is to female and children in poverty is? You know what it is? No. Single parenthood. No man in the household. The greatest defense you have against poverty is having families raising children together. Man and a woman. It actually makes sense. God seems to know what he's talking about. Partnership. You mentioned that one. Partnership. There is a need for companionship. God looked at man and said, it is not good that you be alone. And what kind of companion did he choose? What do you say would be the best long-term companion? Can you not have other friends? No, but this will be the most fulfilling, the most challenging, the most enriching relationship of your life. That's the way he planned it. It was going to be companionship. Another one was, it was meant to be a picture. This is the one that John brought up. It's going to be a demonstration of how Christ loves his church. I'm going to make that the foundational element of that. And the last one was for protection. And that's what we see in our text. God gave a natural urge that most people will have, and he wanted an outlet for it that was spiritually uplifting and proper and would provide a partnership. Understand, marriage is to be a relational, physical, and spiritual union between two people. Those are the three primary aspects. God wanted all three in the relationship. So Paul here focuses on the last one there. Some people in Corinth, though, thought that for the sake of focusing on God, they were going to have celibacy, but they weren't even done there. Try this one. Here's the next question. Maybe I should just never get married. Here's our next solution. If I am married, maybe we should just stop that part of a relationship so that I can be a more spiritual person. So not only celibacy outside of marriage, but celibacy in marriage. And here's their thing. Paul's going to answer that one. And he's going to do it, remember our setting, in a matter-of-fact manner. He isn't going to give you a very picturesque or romantic thing here. He's going to answer the question with the facts. Here's the Joe Friday version of this. Here it comes. Verse 3. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. Well, that sounds great. What a romantic picture. I guess it's time to get into this again. That's not what he's saying. I want you to understand the structure here. He's saying this: if you understand the marital relationship, the expectation is that the physical is part of that relationship. It is not unthinkable that the partner would assume that's going to happen when you get married. He's saying this is part of what you committed to. He's not trying to take the romance out of it. He's just making it plain. This is part of a normal marital relationship. And again, let's think about this. We want to get higher-minded. We want to get more focused on God. And therefore, we want to get away from any kind of thoughts of sexual sin. So the best way to do that is in a natural relationship. I'm going to deny that part of the relationship, and that's going to make me less focused on it as a problem in life. Think about that for a minute. Does that make any sense? You have a God-ordained outlet, a place where this is supposed to occur, and you shut that down to solve the problem of having sexual thoughts and sexual activity you shouldn't have. Does that make any sense whatsoever? And Paul's going, no. How focused is he on this? Verse 4. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body did not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. Oh man, it gets worse. Now they're property. I got chewed out for that when my wife first started working at Cal State Northridge. Guys saw us walking together there, and he goes, "Who is that?" "Well, that's my wife. That's my girl. That's mine." I made that comment. I was very proud of that. Still am. And then one of the professors just tore in. "How dare you talk about her in that way, in a piece of meat? You're seeing her as personal property?" The idea being, no, this is solely mine, a gift that belongs to me. And guess what? I know I got the better end of that. I am solely the gift God gave to her. Bad negotiating there, dear. I'll correct you. But there we are. He is saying this relationship is of such a nature. Understand that the two become what? One flesh. You don't make decisions independently for both of you. That's not your right. You don't decide what's best without discussion, without plans. You don't do that because it's not entirely up to you. You can't make that decision alone.
Uh-oh, the honeydew.
Yeah, so there you go. There's the attitude some people come to. And again, I've had people say, "Yeah, he got mad at me. I'm sleeping on the couch. I'm doing." This is not helping. This is not helping the problem. If you're trying to keep people from falling into relationships they should not have, that's not helping. That's why Jesus said, we were told, don't let the sun go down on your anger.
Yeah.
Why? Remember then? Be angry, but in your anger, do not sin. And if you hold on to the anger, what are you likely to do? And there's a variety of ways of doing that. So here we go. Here's Paul's solution. Do not deprive each other except by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Now, I want you to something. I think this is one of the worst read and illustrated verses I've ever come across. People just don't get to the meaning of here. The Greek has a definite article here. It doesn't say prayer, it says the prayer. Now, why is that important? I want you to come down to this. People might say, well, we're just trying to have a higher mind, and we're going to devote ourselves to prayer. I'm going to pray, and my wife and I, we sleep in separate bedrooms. We haven't been together in over a year because we're just so involved in prayer. That's not what he's saying here. Here's what he's saying. There may come a time in your life where something is of great importance that needs to be dealt with. Maybe there's a death in the family. Maybe there's a sudden illness. Maybe there's something that's happened. Maybe there's a huge decision you have to make. And your mind is churning on that, you're struggling with that, and it says this, if the two of you said, we're going to set aside a time for the two of us to pray about this particular issue and seek God's solution to it and seek God's answer to it, he's saying, that's fine. Say, we're going to put all of our efforts into this. We're not going to have any distractions for a time until this is settled. He says, that's fine. He's not saying, so that we can have a better prayer life, we're taking this out of our relationship. No, for a particular issue, the prayer, we will do this. But notice he says, this shouldn't be for a long period of time. How do I know that? Consent at any time, so that you, do not deprive each other except by mutual consent, and that for a time, it's a short time, then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. You get that? How long does it take for us to develop a lack of self-control? I don't think we have that issue pretty frequently, and it comes out quickly. So he's saying, again, here's his answer. Is celibacy in marriage a solution to the problem? No, because what do you lack? Self-control. This is what we need to deal with to get this right. Then come together again. Now, popping this through, I say this as, now how does yours word? I say this as a what? Concession. That's what most of you have right there. The idea of concession and so forth. Actually, the best way to say this, I say this by way of understanding. I get why it's a problem. He's not making a concession because he would prefer that none of you ever got married or all stayed single. He's no, I'm saying this because I understand something that obviously you don't. I get the idea, I get the problem here that you're not seeing. And I'm putting this out by way of an understanding of the issue. Not as a command, but as sound advice. This just makes more sense if you think about it. Now look how he finishes here. I wish that all of you were as I am. Well, there it is. Paul clearly is back to this idea that celibacy is the best answer. Right? He said it right there. I want everybody to be just like me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Couple of critical things going on here. One, is not a command. The other thing is this. Here's what Paul is saying. Your original question was, is celibacy the answer? He's saying celibacy is an okay solution if you are what? Gifted, if you're like me. And he's saying this. If you were going to make that decision, I wish all of you were equipped to make that decision without any ramification, without any problems like I am. I wish you could do that. I'll put an example to you. A man is planning to serve God. He wants to go on the mission field. And he decides, you know what? I'm going to forego marriage because I'm going to go into a dangerous mission field and I wouldn't want to put a wife through that. That's a valid concern that he would have. But if he's not gifted for that, and he goes into the mission field trying to deny an aspect of life that's perfectly normal for him, how's that going to go?
Very well.
Not well. And Paul is saying, yeah, I get it. In life, there are some decisions that would be a lot easier if this wasn't part of it. In fact, we'll get into that later, and he'll say, you have to do this because a man has divided attention. He has to be concerned about what's good for his wife. Well, that's right. That's perfectly normal. God wants you to be concerned about that in a relationship. You're supposed to have that perfectly normal. But Paul recognizes that for people like himself, out there in the dangerous field and so forth, if you didn't have to deal with that, that'd probably be easier. Because I'll tell you this, isn't it a lot easier to face the possibility of death and pain than it is to see your children or your wife face that?
Amen.
Tradition tells us that to try to break Peter, you know what they did first? They tortured and crucified his wife. Now that is a rough one. Compelled him to watch that. So, Paul gets it. Yeah, I wish that it was that simple a solution. It was that simple a discussion like it is for me. But I know it's not. You can't make that kind of decision the way I did. You're going to have a harder time with this because you are not gifted for this capacity. You can't go there. Now, I put out one more thing to you. Paul speaks with a lot of knowledge here because in our best of knowledge, Paul was married at one time. I want you to understand this. To be a member of the Sanhedrin, you had to be. It was required. Now, we don't know what happened to Paul's wife. We do not know because he does not say. Now, I'll tell you this. He didn't just run off to the mission field and leave her at home by himself because Paul makes it very plain that that is not in God's plan. What are the likelihoods?
Death.
They probably made him break away.
The family may have taken the wife away when he became a Christian. It may have been stripped from him. Very possibly. Not his choice. I mean, Paul is going to talk about that if an unbelieving spouse wants to leave. So Paul may have not had a choice, or she may have passed. She may be dead. But Paul does understand this situation because at some point it is most likely, from what our understanding of the rules that were required for him to be a member of the Sanhedrin, he probably was married. He gets it. What's up?
Maybe she was the thorn in the flesh.
Oh, gosh. Why did I ask? Okay, I just want to I'm going to end it there because I wanted to set this. But I hope you're understanding here. Do you get how we have to approach this passage to get an understanding of it? We do not just stop at the purity of the words. We have to understand the context in which Paul speaks. Why is he addressing this the way he is? What is going on here? He is answering a series of questions, matter-of-factly, to the point, and he's going to be rather cut and dried about it because he's trying to cover a rather lengthy list of issues that were brought before him. And we're going to nail these one after the other with that understanding of how we approach the text in mind. We'll close this one off.